Hi, welcome to a Sunny Book Nook. Today I am talking about all the books that I read in May. So I'll be going through them as usual, and if you haven't watched one of my wrap-ups before, welcome and please subscribe. But if you have, you know the drill. It's gonna be what I read at the beginning all the way to what I read at the end. And I'm also going to tell you guys where I read these books, like through what platform, physical, digital, audio from the library, etc. And I will also be telling you why I picked them up, just because I feel like I don't talk about those things necessarily in most of my wrap-ups, but I feel like it'd be interesting to share. And also because I started working on a spreadsheet of all the books that I've read this year so far, and I have like 15 categories for each book, of course the title, the author, but also whether it's from an indie press or not, whether, it's queer or not, what race or background the author is from, whether the book is translated or not, that sort of thing. And then also like how I read it, via audio or physical, whether I own that book or not. Just like stats like that, so that it's easier for me to talk about the stats breakdown of my reads in my end of year book video, and also my halfway through the year video, which will be coming soon because we're in our 6th month of a 12-month Gregorian calendar cycle. All right, let's get started on the books. The final book that I read in April was Stag Dance, which is right here, and that was something I read for Lesbian Feminist Book Club. But the first book that I read in May was something that I read for myself, and that is Girl on Girl: How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves by Sophie Gilbert. I listened to the audio book of this through the Penguin Random House audio app, which is actually only available to booksellers. So that's my privilege, but that's how I listened to it. And I wanted to pick it up just because I saw it on the shelves. If you read my Substack, which you should, subscribe in the, sign up, put in your email for the inbox at the link down below. But if you read that, you'll know that I am a bookseller. So I do see a lot of, front list new hardcover titles that I'm like, oh, that looks interesting, I might as well pick it up, right? So this one was in our feminism section, which, I love feminism. And also it's about pop culture, which I also love, and I love talking about, as you would know if you listen to my podcast. Not me plugging everything, please. But yeah, so Girl on Girl, it was a solid audiobook. I don't remember if the narrator had like a British accent or not, but I think Sophie Gilbert is from the UK. Like, I don't think she's an American writer, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so this book is okay. I rated it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It was just kind of like a journalistic rehash of early 2000s, 90s pop culture and, the tabloid racket and the way that, the public treated people like Britney Spears or Madonna. She talks a lot about, porn and women's sexuality and perceptions around this. But I feel like the book doesn't really deliver on the subtitle of how pop culture turned a generation of women against themselves. Like, I don't think it necessarily explains that for real. And I also don't think that the analysis was really quite there, per se. Like, I think it is, again, more of a journalistic rehashing. And I think also the ultimate conclusion and the takeaway from the book is very much about, like, oh, and Hillary lost the election, boo-hoo, Which I think, like, is a lot of millennial women writers who write about, like, pop culture and feminism often, hone in on. And then, of course, talking about the Me Too movement. But I feel like it often falls flat because it doesn't really acknowledge the really complex relationship between the market and women's bodies and women in political power, and the way that political power is dependent on the obfuscation and exploitation of primarily third world women, right? Like, it's not, in that way, it is quite a liberal book, right? Like, it's not as interested in examining the radical, at the root aspects of things like women and pop culture, the topic of this book, and more so at the surface, more so just talking about things that I kind of already knew, but in a little bit more greater detail. But it was just the analysis falls flat because it's quite a liberal analysis. It wasn't really that satisfying. So honestly, more like a 2.5, 3-star-ish book. I mean, it's fine, but I wouldn't really recommend it. At least not to a reader who has similar tastes to like me, I guess. I don't know. So that was the first book I read in May, kind of a flop, unfortunately. The next book I read in May was The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering by Norman G. Finkelstein. I listened to the audiobook of this one. Once again, I checked it out through the library on Libby, and I really liked it. I learned a lot. I gave it 4 stars, though, because I think that the first half of the book was much more interesting to me than the second half of the book, which really looks into and examines and does this really journalistic, muckraking, looking through the details of it all approach to the whole reparations racket, basically, against Swiss banks that different organizations took on, took on the mantle of. And Finkelstein goes into the weeds and the details of this in a way that is, of course, necessary to, pull out the receipts and really get into the nitty-gritty of it. But I just was like, okay. But seeing how now I'm tuning out because I don't really care that much. But I think that the general thesis of this book was really compelling, and it is very much, I think, help fine-tune or shift or adjust the way that I understand Holocaust history and the way that the general American public understands Holocaust history and the Shoah and Jewish suffering. As Norm Finkelstein writes in the subtitle, the exploitation of it. It is a really, really compelling book, and I would really recommend everyone read it, honestly, because Finkelstein also has this real sharp sense of, Jewish humor and dark humor, of course, as well, right, where it is very readable, very listenable, and again, darkly funny. You'll be laughing at some of the jokes that he's making, even though obviously he's talking about the aftermath of the Holocaust and the ways that the state of Israel, as a way of justifying its own existence, uses the Holocaust to do that, and how the way that Americans memorialize the Holocaust is deeply related to this Zionist propaganda. I mean, it is a book that makes some really, really, I guess, shocking claims to people who have existed under a regime of mass media and, Western media, and how we understand the atrocities of World War II. But I think it's a really sharp analysis and necessary intervention on the ways that people understand how something like this could happen, right? And I think that Finkelstein's main points, right, that the exploitation of Jewish suffering to justify the genocide and displacement of others, the way that anti-Semitism itself is seen as this kind of nonsensical thing that emerges from nowhere except, delusions and this innate hatred of non-Jews have of Jews, that he's this is not a rational explanation of the existence of anti-Semitism. And he also talks about the ways that people who want to make the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, this specific and unique thing that is more profound or more devastating than other types of atrocities or other genocides throughout history and even recent history, he's that's bullshit, right? I mean, Norman himself is the child of 2 Holocaust survivors. His mother and father both were in multiple Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and they survived. He grew up, I think, in Chicago, and he talks about his own, in the first chapter, which I think is worth reading for anyone. And if you don't read the book, at least that first chapter is really important. You can find it online. he talks about like the way that no one really thought about or talked about the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, in this way until he was much older, and because it became more politically convenient and in fact expedient to use the Holocaust as a way to bolster the existence of different Zionist and bourgeois, institutions that really benefit from specific narratives about Jewish suffering and Jewish history. So it's very, very interesting. I highly recommend it. I think that it is quite illuminating in how he identifies the way that it's utterly convenient and disingenuous for American politicians and American institutions to be so concerned with the fate of the Jew or, anti-Semitism more broadly in the face of the many types of violence and discrimination that exist in the world. So yeah, it's really good. Would really recommend it. And obviously he explains everything about this much more coherently and with much more evidence than I do, so would recommend. Then the next book that I read was Not for the Faint of Heart by Lex Croucher. Hard pivot to a YA romance. It's a lesbian romance set during medieval times. It's kind of like following the second generation after Robin Hood and his band of, his band of bandits. And we are following two characters, one of whom is part of this crew, but it kind of feels like a dynastic sort of hierarchical situation. And another person who is basically like kidnapped by the crew or is taken hostage for apparently collaborating with the sheriff or whatever. And she is a healer, so she knows herbs but also like she is a purveyor of what we would now consider like modern medicine, right? Where she's like, this is how I treat wounds and illnesses, not any of this humors bullshit, right? Like she is kind of ahead of the curve for that. And so anyway, I read this book because I really love Lex Croucher's book, Gwen and I Are Not in Love, which is right here. I love that YA queer romance, also set in sort of ye olden times, medieval times, in a castle. Love that book. I also really like her sort of rendition on an Austen type story with Reputation, which I think is an adult romance. Might be YA, but I don't remember anymore. And so I liked both those books, right? So I'm like, oh, of course I'm gonna like this one. I put a hold on it for the audiobook through Libby on the library like months ago at this point because I really wanted to read her latest book because I really liked two of her other books. I'm sorry to say that it was a flop. It was not good. I rated it like 2.5 stars, which I think might be generous. It might have to be a 2-star. I don't know. It's just not, it wasn't good. Like, it wasn't a good romance. I was not convinced of these two girls' feelings for each other or kind of the banter turning into like, in enemies to lover situation. Like, I was not convinced of that. And I also thought that the political mechanisms and the pacing and the plot were all just so flimsy and fell apart so easily and very unconvincing, I think, is my general feeling towards every aspect of this book. The characterization, to the plot, to the romance. I really thought that it was, I didn't like it. I didn't even like the sort of like forest bandit environment, and I thought that the relationships that these characters had with understanding like the truth of their own backgrounds and also of each other, my main problems I'm finding to be with romances, which is that the problems that these characters face, the problems that these characters have in their development and in, coming to a happy ending, all feel so obvious, feel so simple, and it's just not satisfying, therefore, when a resolution comes around, because I'm like, okay, clearly the main problem with this character is that she has rose-colored glasses when it comes to this relationship in her life, and if she resolves that, then she will be able to move forward with her life in a much better way. But then, like, of course, the whole book doesn't let that happen until the third act conflict or towards the end. Otherwise, there's no story there, right? They're trying to draw a character arc, but it just doesn't work. I didn't like this very much, unfortunately, because I had really high expectations, but whatever. The next book that I read in May was Care, The Highest Stage of Capitalism by Premilla Nadasen. This book I rated 5 stars, or maybe 4.5, but I loved this book. I thought it was profoundly interesting and moving and coherent politically and well-researched, thoroughly argued, very well organized. It's very short. I listened to the audiobook via Hoopla, which is another library service, and I think, well, I would also recommend the audiobook. It's a good audiobook. Each chapter talks about a different aspect of the care industry, right? So whether that be domestic workers who from the Philippines who are often labor trafficked, or that be the nonprofit industrial complex that undergirds a lot of how care gets distributed, and then also the conversations about reproductive care and the legacy of like the wages for housework movement, and also just Marxist feminist reproductive labor conversations and discourses that have been going on for the past, at this point, half a century. And she kind of brings together all of these facts, all of these aspects of this case, right? How care is privatized, what organizing for care workers looks like present day, and also the various exploitative rackets that people run up, whether that be within nonprofits or how families who hire maids or live-in nannies or, just reproductive care workers and care workers in general will be like, oh, you're part of the family, but of course be extremely exploitative and terrible. So it's a very, very good book. It's a book that I think any feminist or person concerned with labor rights, which hopefully you would be a feminist if you are, I think anyone who has this interest or cares about the privatization of care and reproductive care and examining the care industry from a critical lens, which I think we should all do, because we all have to interact with the healthcare industry in some aspect, or dealing with the reality of being old or sick or disabled and needing someone else to take care of you, or the reality of like paying someone else for housework, and all these conversations, all these realities that people contend with. I think this book really coherently addresses, without giving you these rote answers of being like, this, by and large, by being like, this thing is bad, so don't do this. It's not so much that, as much as it's looking at how people who do exist within these labor schemas of reproductive care organize for better working conditions, and also help empower others and understand themselves as workers and community. And also, the way that nonprofits themselves are often, some bullshit. It's a really good book. I would really recommend it. 4.5, 5 stars. Please pick this one up. And if you have Hoopla, you should be able to check out the audiobook. So, the next book that I read was Feminism, Capitalism, and Ecology by Johanna Oksala, or Johanna Oksala? I'm not sure. This book is an academic press title. I read the ebook, and I actually made an audiobook of it, excluding the final chapter because I didn't have time to record the final chapter. I made an audiobook of it because we were reading it for Lesbian Feminist Book Club. The book didn't already have an pre-existing audiobook, so I was like, okay, I'll just record myself reading it, which I did for another book that we read earlier this year for Lesbian Feminist Book Club. If I have water on my lips, it's because I just drank some more water, which you should also do. And I did not like this. I read this book, I rated this book like 2 stars. In our discussion of this title, which if you're in the book club, you should be able to watch all the recordings of our previous meetings. It's like in an unlisted playlist. In our discussions, I talk more extensively about why, but I feel like the language itself was quite dense and difficult to read and parse through because it was quite repetitive in the specific like syntax and, you know, vocabulary words that were being used over and over again. And also because some of the ideas here, right, trying to talk about and summarize and do this almost like a literature review of different ways that people have looked at nature and ecology in the context of capitalism and feminism when it comes to, you know, pro-capitalism or anti-capitalism feminisms. And also her final chapter is called Should Feminists Pay for Housework? I mean, I think like each chapter also tries to address this reality of like biotechnology and like the biotechnologization, what's the, girl, you sound crazy. Anyway, basically how biotech is using women's bodies and also within like exploiting women from this misogynistic and capitalist cannibalism that encroaches. And I don't know, I found a lot of what she was writing a little bit unconvincing, a little bit things that, she talks about surrogacy also within that framework of talking about bio-capitalism and women's bodies and labor exploitation, but it just wasn't as good as some of the other stuff that I've read, right? Like, it wasn't as interesting as, like, Full Surrogacy Now by Sophie Lewis, or even her other book, Enemy Feminisms, where she talks about different ways, like, you know, capitalist feminism and the failure of that approach, but not so much within the philosophical, political science schema, right? More so from a history perspective, which I find more interesting because I care more about that, and I like the language and the writing of that sort of style more so than philosophy and poli-sci. So, yeah, and then I feel like also with the concept of care and reproductive care and the debates around this, again, I think the book Care, The High Stage of Capitalism by Premilla and Nadasen is a better book than this. And also when it comes to nature and the relationship between capitalism and the earth, women in the earth, women, capitalism, and ecology, right? The whole concept of this book, ostensibly, I feel like the book Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici is just a much more interesting job at looking at these things, right? So basically this book I found deeply unsatisfying because I've read other books that I think talk about these issues more coherently, more persuasively, and with takeaways that I agree with far more than what this book's conclusion in each of these different chapters seems to be. So had to be a 2-star, I'm so sorry. Okay, and then the next book that I read, which this has kind of been interesting, you know, we've been flipping back and forth between 2.5-star reads to like 4.5, 5-star reads with every other book, so that's the kind of reading month I was up to, I guess. The next book I read was a fiction title. It's called Bad Nature by Ariel Courage. This book I rated 5 stars. I loved this book. I thought that it was fucking crazy in the best way possible. I mean, I adored the darkness of this, the humor of it, and the way that it deals with and tackles concepts like, you know, alienation and isolation and what to make of one's life, and dealing with childhood trauma, and also being like an egotistical, arrogant asshole and how that shapes your life and your goals and who you are, right? So this book I picked up through Libby. I think I placed a hold on the audiobook and then it came through. Another recent release that kind of caught my eye when it was on the new fiction title shelves. I listened to the audiobook, which I would really recommend. I really enjoyed it. I thought that this book was so brutal because it basically, the concept is that it follows this like corporate lawyer, makes a lot of money, lives in New York, doesn't really love the city, really doesn't love anything or anyone, including herself, and has no real relationships in her life whatsoever. Okay, sorry, I got interrupted and had to reframe the shot because my camera stopped recording, as you know, If you've been around here, you know the drill. Anyway, basically, Bad Nature is about a woman who is, I think, in her 40s or something, and she's a corporate lawyer. She kind of is a bit soulless. Well, I would say very much so. Has no real relationships in her life. Unmarried, childless. Her only ex is her college boyfriend, whom she hasn't spoken to in like 17 years. Basically, she has an ongoing grudge against her abusive, terrible father who sent her mother into an early grave. And our main character, she gets a cancer diagnosis, and basically the doctor tells her, you have like 3 months to live. So she quits her job and basically goes on a cross-country road trip with the singular goal of killing her dad. So it is quite comical, but also so dark and quite brutal. She ends up running across this kind of hitchhiker guy who goes around the country documenting, I forgot what they're called. They're basically like almost like chemical waste sites. She ends up, running into this younger guy who is a total opposite of her, right? Like has hope and conviction, which she has none of. And we basically follow her as she attempts to go from New York City to California to get her dad and get him back. She's on a one-woman mission that she obviously can't tell anyone about. And it's quite interesting. I really loved this book. I thought it was so cruel, but also quite illuminating when it comes to understanding like the human condition and the reality of loneliness and alienation and holding that sort of deep hatred, and it's more so than like a grudge, but really just a fervent disgust towards someone who she hates. And it's just about that. It's about a woman who's a hater who hates and who goes on this cross-country road trip to kill her dad. And I think like within that premise itself, it delivers completely on this, and it's quite, it's well written. There's some beautiful moments and sentences throughout that I think were really touching and moving and profound and made me think a lot. And I really love literary fiction about crazy ass women who are kind of deeply reprehensible as people, but are nonetheless fascinating to follow. And I think this book was very much that for me, and I loved it. I really loved it. I would really recommend it. Then we're gonna go to another nonfiction title. This is a book that I've been meaning to read since its announcement, and I finally borrowed it as an audiobook from the library, even though the author himself, he did kind of shade audiobook listeners on his story, so sorry, I guess. This is Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal by Mohammed El-Kurd. This is a book about being Palestinian within our current political matrices and discourses about what the Palestinian condition and person even is, the dehumanization that Palestinians face, and also the way that like anti-Semitism in its conceptual forms, or the ideological sort of monster and beast as understood and represented within global media and within, specifically US media, how it is used and it receives this particular type of attention when in the face of the actual mass death and slaughtering of Palestinians, especially right now in Gaza, and for the last 600 days over that at this point, how these two things are seen as not even equal weights, but rather one thing, the ideological possibility of anti-Semitism in this vague concept is valued over the actual lives of human beings and people. The tagline of this book is pitched as this century's discourse on colonialism, Aimé Césaire's seminal text. And I would really have to agree with that. I think this is a book that very much is about the colonial imagination and the decolonial struggle and what that means when you are playing on somebody else's terms, playing in a playing field that doesn't even recognize you as a human being person. What that means for the real life people who are suffering under these regimes of terror, the psychic damage and the real material horrors and damage that people face under occupation, under genocidal violence and mania, and how it is absolutely insane and not even worth entertaining. A lot of the things that are lobbed against Palestinians in accusations, right? This idea of you must be a perfect victim to be justified in your death and your martyrdom, or in the state's persecution of you and your slaughter. It's fundamentally so fucked up, and yet it is what Palestinians are subjected to while experiencing famine and bombs and displacement. I think Mohammed El-Kurd is a fantastic writer and incisive in how he moves between talking about his own experiences, the political realities of the Palestinian as a figure in media and in the collective sort of Western imagination. It moves between that and also a sort of poetic and angry writing style, right? It's not just one thing, it's a lot of things. It feels like a manifesto. It feels like it's poetry, it's rage, it's theory. It is a really strong and persuasive argument for not, the trying to prove one's humanity to one's oppressor, but in opposing that, in fighting against that impulse, and what it means that some people's lives are less important than ideas or sentiments or thoughts or things that are expressed in words, in opposition to the reality of like bombs and genocide. Why are these two things seen as even in the same playing ground, in the same field, in the same general vicinity of each other, as if they're equivalent when they're not? Nothing justifies this sort of mass murder. Everyone needs to read this book. It's quite short. It is obviously difficult, but also very readable and well argued and so articulated. And articulated so piercingly, it kind of shakes you at your core. And it's what people need. It's what you need. I think of all the books that I'm talking about in this video, this is the book that you should read if you get a single recommendation from this list. Perfect Victims of the Politics of Appeal. It is so good, and it will yank you from fear and inaction in a way that is like a slap in the face of reality. The next book that I read was another 5-star nonfiction read, and this was The Women's House of Detention, A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison. I listened to this on audio as well, and I listened to it through Everand, which is a subscription service. You pay, I think, $12.99 a month or something to access 3 unlocks of audiobooks or ebooks on the platform. And it's what I use if I can't find a book on Hoopla or Libby or on the Penguin Random House thing, or it's not offered as a Libro FM, ALC, or something. So, my last resort, but very helpful for situations like this. I read The Women's House of Detention because one of my friends recommended this in our Lesbian Feminist Book Club meeting when we were discussing A Short History of Transmisogyny by Jules Gill Peterson. And this book had been on my radar for months and months now, and also because it's mentioned in Dead in the Frame by Stephen Spotswood, the most recent, I think, 5th book in the Pentecost and Parker series, which is one of my favorite series of all times. I love it so much, and I could do a whole video talking about it and the sort of prison abolitionist politics within this book, politics of victimhood, politics of queer and feminist existence within the specific setting of the 1940s in New York City, right? Like, I could do a whole video about it, but I feel like I'm kind of part of such a niche audience in talking about the Pentecost and Parker series, because I'm like, not that many people, I feel like no one I know, besides like 2 or 3 people have also read it, and no one I know loves it as much as I do. So, but anyway, in the 5th book in the series, Dead in the Frame, half of the book is set in the House of D, which is what women who were incarcerated there called it. And it existed for many decades, and it was a women's prison in New York. It no longer exists. It's been torn down, and now in its place there is like a little park and garden. But it is also, near all the gay institutions, right? Like a couple blocks away from like Stonewall, right on the street on Christopher Street, gays and trans people existed and met. And the way that the House of D, as this, physical architectural institution, shaped queer lives is so well explored in this book. And we look at specific cases of different women and different trans masks and different people who were at one point incarcerated or caught up in this system, and the various prison reformers and social workers and organizations that attempted to like help or intervene within these people's lives, and also the reality of what incarceration in the House of D looked like and what changed over the years. It's profoundly moving and a very important text for anyone who really wants to understand queer history, right? Like 20th century American queer history is often viewed in this very myopic way, right? It's like there were the bars and then Stonewall and now we have gay rights, right? Like there's a very clear arc that people kind of understand, but this book looks at the emergence of different like homophile organizations and the gay liberationist movement in relationship to the House of D, right? A place that primarily incarcerated working class, poor, gay people, women, and trans people, and often sex workers, people who were facing circumstances often completely out of their control, and of course how the carceral state responds to that. It is a book that has a real prison abolitionist impetus. It really is a feminist and lesbian intervention on queer history and those who make queer history, and how we understand the movers and the shapers and the shakers of queer history, and the ways that different people that we understand and laud in our feminist and queer histories, whether that be Mabel Hampton or Angela Davis or even Andrea Dworkin, how people came in and out of this specific place, the Women's House of D, and how that's so overlooked in labor histories, communist organizing histories, right? Early to mid 20th century histories of queer life. And yet this was at the center of it in so many ways. So I rated it 5 stars. I thought it was fantastic. I learned so much. I learned the stories of so many women and cool ass gay people, and just their life stories as, ultimately primarily documented through their experiences within the House of D and in relationship to and in and out of the carceral system. So very good book. Highly recommend it. If you're a feminist, this also talks a lot about butch femme history as well, right? And like trans history, because this is, this prison housed a lot of butches and femmes and trans people, working class dykes, working class queer women who were imprisoned for their survival, their sex work, or in their escaping unsafe situations, or in just being homeless, or, dressing as a man, right? Like, just so good. If you're a butch, if you're a femme, if you're trans, if you're a communist, if you're someone who's interested in history, if you have any inkling of interest in queer history and queer American history specifically, you should read this. It's very good. Very, very comprehensive and compelling and well-researched, thoroughly examined, looks at a lot of different primary documents and interviews and just the life stories of so many people in a profoundly moving and interesting and informative way. Once again, highly recommend it. The next book that I read was Paradise Logic by Sophie Kemp, and I hate this cover. What is this cover? This fuck-ass cover. Like, oh my god. Anyway, I listened to the audiobook. I checked it out via Libby, and this is also kind of a new release. And I've heard some buzz about it. You know, a lot of the New York cool girls have been, you know, I've been seeing some people post about, you know, readings and the book launch for this. But I found it so weird. And I think it is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be a very strange book. I rated it 3 stars. I didn't love it, but I also didn't hate it. It is so alienating and strange, but in a way that I haven't necessarily encountered before in a book, where our main character, this girl, seems to be existing on another plane of existence, right? Like, she is not in touch with reality, and also it seems maybe that she might be a little bit, or kind of, it's never really explicitly identified, but it seems that she might be mentally disabled or kind of like intellectually underdeveloped or something like that. And we're in her kind of first person point of view perspective the whole time. And she flits in and out of like reality a lot. She has this idea that she wants to be the perfect girlfriend, and that is her job in life. And we follow her as she tries to do this with her crack addict boyfriend who's a PhD student at Columbia for archaeology or something. And just, it's also very, like, vague and drifts in and out of different perspectives and scopes of reality, you know, looking at, like, you know, the Adam and Eve thing, the digital world thing, all this, you know, there's something going on throughout this book. And it also there's a lot of, like, sex scenes that are really disturbing and weird. And there's a lot of just terrible, weird shit that's going on. But it was like one of the weirdest writing styles I've ever encountered. So yeah, props to the author for that, I guess. You know, I thought that it was so strange that I couldn't, I don't even know what to compare it to, I guess. So, I mean, I didn't love my experience reading it, but also it was quite novel for me. So 3 stars. The next book that I read was another audiobook I listened to via the Libby app through the library. Once again, mouth is wet because I've been drinking water. This book I buddy read with my friend, who is my primary co-host of Lesbian Feminist Book Club. And this book is called Blood Feast by Malika Moustadraf. She was, because she passed, she was a Moroccan feminist writer. This is a short story collection translated from Arabic with an interesting epilogue describing the reality of the author's life and her role and her status and her being a figure within the Arab women's literature movement of, I think it was 70s, 80s, around that time. And I think that all of these stories are quite dark and abrupt. They follow different experiences and perspectives, whether that be, you know, an abusive, sick husband who's trying to get some health care, or that be a wife who is trying to look at her marriage and her relationship that's kind of falling apart, or that be a possibly intersex, possibly trans character who is dealing with this, you know, this society and interacting with people who, and their father who doesn't really, isn't understanding this person's reality. I think that all the different perspectives we explore and the different political lenses and the feminist experiences and kind of things that she articulates here are all so compelling and interesting and very specific to this Moroccan context, to this time and place, and to the experiences of marginalized people, of women, and of those who make women's lives terrible. And yeah, I think one of my favorite stories is about a woman who runs away from her abusive husband and fuck-ass father with her baby. And it's really sad. All these stories are quite sad and bleak, but in this sort of like social realism sense. So I enjoyed this. I rated it 4 stars. I would really recommend it if you're trying to get into women's, into Arab women's literature, this is a good place to start because it's very short and full of, lots of very good short stories. Next book that I read was another nonfiction title, that is The AI Con: How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want by Emily M. Bender and Alex, I forgot his last name. But this is a book that was super illuminating for me, right? Because I hate AI. Okay, I think that it is a blight to our society. We need to do everything we can to fight it, as this book argues and presents. And it looks at this from, this sort of tech industry standpoint of like, how does the venture capitalism of it all bolster this idea that like AI is inevitable, we all need to integrate it into our lives, into our workplaces. At once it is an existential threat to humanity and what's going to replace all work. And so this book really examines the bullshit narratives surrounding AI from tech companies and tech CEOs, and also like poking holes in the bullshit and examining exactly how different forms of what is marketed as AI works, because they also really take down this concept of AI, where basically it's like, it's just a selling point, it's a marketing term. It doesn't actually describe anything about the product that a company is trying to sell, and it also isn't effective. Like, it doesn't do what it's claiming to do, and the ways that people respond to it and use it are not a reflection of its capacity as a form of technology. And it also is, this book is quite incisive when it comes to how, in general, technology is presented as a way of solving people's problems, solving societal issues, when that's not how anything works ever, actually, right? Like, they also talk about the reality of the labor exploitation inherent to, generative AI, and also the environmental destruction that this process creates, whether that be of gig workers in Kenya, having to interact with and watch triggering terrible violent content and say as many slurs to the AI generator thing so that it can learn how to parse through that and not respond to that, whether that be that or the actual like mining required for it and the amount of water waste that it uses. So I really encourage you to read this book if you are curious about AI in general, if you don't know why it's bad or good, what people are actually saying about it, and like how legit it is. I think this book does a really good job at pointing all that down and pulling it out from the bullshit that people are hawking it to be, and it gives you tools for how to see through that shit and also how to work against it. I rated it 5 stars because I thought it was an absolute banger, which was my Goodreads review of it, but it was really good and really informative. I learned a lot. I also felt more justified in my sort of pre-existing opinions about AI, which were of course always negative, but I didn't think that this book was so much preaching to the choir as much as it was, again, giving me a lot of information that I didn't necessarily have a real grasp on before. And also these concepts that they articulate are really useful, right? Like looking at how the doomers and I forgot, they have this sort of like these two different approaches, this like parameter of the doomers and those who kind of embrace it and hype it up, and how they're basically two sides of the same coin. It's really good. I would really recommend it. The second to last book that I read, or at least finished, in the month of May was My Lesbian Novel by Renee Gladden. I talk about this in my BMF video, my video where I talk about some current reads, some products I've used up, and what I've been eating, what I've been wearing, that kind of thing. But this was a 4-star read. I thought that it was a really interesting work of experimental fiction, creative nonfiction. It is structured in a way that is kind of an interview between Renee Gladden and interviewer, just like some vague, entity, and it spans like many years, but it also brings us into Renee Gladden's novel that she's writing, this her lesbian novel, and she also takes shots at lesbian romance and romance in general that I think are so accurate and apt and so funny and good. I think this is a book that's really concerned with like language and writing and art making and the processes of creating characters and relationships. And I think anyone who is curious about these things or cares about these things and loves a sort of more experimental form or just something slightly out of the box, you should read this. It's very short. And again, the formatting is such that the italics are the book, her lesbian novel, and then the rest of it is an interview. Also, the lighting has changed so drastically, but that's because it was storming this morning. Well, not storming, it was raining really heavily, then it was sunny, and now the clouds are back out, so I apologize for the lighting adjustments throughout this. I can't control the weather. And the final book that I read in May was another lesbian feminist book club read. This was our fiction pick for May, Eleutheria by Allegra Hyde. This was a 4-star read for me. I thought that it was so strange and compelling and weird and also very cool. I mean, it's about a girl who was raised by these sort of doomsday prepper parents, and she joins a sort of climate cult on an island, on a Caribbean island that's fictional, called Eleutheria, and she was also kind of sent there, or rather she is going there off the tail end of a really fucked up like lesbian relationship that she had with this Harvard professor. And while all this is happening, a sort of dystopian climate apocalypse is kind of raining down around her. So it is a piece of climate fiction, and it's also lesbian, it's also weird, it's very strange, and I liked it a lot. I discussed it really extensively with the book club, of course, so you should join that if you would like, linked down below, as always. I kind of talked this one out already, so if you're in the book club, or, you know, you should be able to, you either participated in the chat or in the book discussion where you can watch it, the recording. So I like this, would recommend it, thought it was a very interesting work of eco-fiction, and still was able to deal with some of these relationships and weird emotional moments in a really compelling and interesting way. So I liked it. All right, finally, that is all that I read. I think 12 books that I read in May. I did read a lot of nonfiction, and a lot of it I really enjoyed, with like one exception. But yeah, I really appreciate you watching this video. Please let me know which one of these books most interested you, what you're gonna put on your TBR, what you're gonna try to read in this upcoming month. And also, happy Pride Month. It's Pride Month. I'm gonna try to read almost only queer books, hopefully, in this month. I'm already off to a good start, I think. If you're friends with me on Goodreads or you follow me on Goodreads, which again, always linked down below, you should be able to see a sneak peek of that. But yeah, I hope that your reading month was well. Let me know how many books you ended up reading in the comments if you would like. As well, and if you get to this part of the video, please comment your favorite flower for spring and summer, and I will hopefully see you in my next one. Bye!